February 9, 2004. A Saturn sedan sits abandoned on a desolate stretch of Route 112 in Haverhill, New Hampshire. The front end is crumpled against a snowbank. The windshield has spiderwebbed into a constellation of cracks. The driver's side door hangs open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. But here's what makes your blood run cold. The driver is gone, vanished into the New Hampshire wilderness on a night when temperatures plunge below zero. No footprints leading away. No blood trail. No body. Just an eerie collection of clues that would launch one of the most perplexing missing persons cases in American history. This is the story of Maura Murray, a 21-year-old nursing student who disappeared into thin air, leaving behind more questions than answers. And 2 decades later, we're still searching for the truth. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. The 911 call came in at 7:37 p.m. Faith Westman, a local resident, reported seeing a car off the road near the intersection of Route 112 and Bradley Hill Road. The vehicle had struck a tree on the sharp corner locals called the Weathered Barn Curve, a notorious bend that had claimed its share of vehicles over the years. Faith watched from her window as the Saturn's hazard lights blinked rhythmically against the darkness. She saw movement near the car. Someone was still there, but Faith didn't go outside. Something about the scene unsettled her. Instead, she called the police and watched. Within minutes, her neighbor, a school bus driver named Butch Atwood, pulled up in his bus after dropping off his last passenger. Butch would become one of the most critical witnesses in this entire mystery, and his 7-minute encounter with the woman at the crash site would be analyzed, dissected, and debated for years to come. Butch later reported that he stopped his bus and asked the young woman if she needed help or wanted him to call the police. She was standing outside the vehicle, appeared shaken but coherent, and insisted she was fine. She'd already called AAA, she told him. Butch noticed she wasn't dressed for the weather, just a light jacket on a frigid February night. He offered to let her wait in his warm bus or come back to his house to call for help. She declined, politely but firmly. She just wanted to be left alone. Something about her demeanor struck Butch as odd. She seemed more anxious about him calling the police than about her wrecked car or the freezing temperature. But he was a good Samaritan, not an interrogator. He drove the short distance to his house, less than 100 yards away, and immediately called 911 at 7:43 p.m., just 6 minutes after Faith Westman's call. Here's where the timeline becomes absolutely critical. Between 7:43 p.m., when Butch called 911, and 7:46 p.m., when Sergeant Cecil Smith arrived at the scene, Maura Murray vanished. 9 minutes. That's the window we're talking about. In 9 minutes, a young woman disappeared so completely that despite massive searches involving helicopters, search dogs, infrared equipment, and hundreds of volunteers combing 60 square miles of wilderness, not a single trace of her has ever been found. When Sergeant Smith pulled up to the crash site, the Saturn was empty. The driver's door was locked. The car was cold. The engine had been off for some time. He walked the immediate area, shining his flashlight into the tree line, calling out. Nothing. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through bare branches and the occasional crack of ice settling in the darkness. Inside the vehicle, investigators would later find a curious collection of items. A AAA card belonging to Maura's father. MapQuest directions to Burlington, Vermont. A book titled Not Without Peril, about mountain climbing accidents in the White Mountains. A chilling choice given the circumstances. Boxes of wine, both opened and unopened. And perhaps most telling, a hastily printed email from her boyfriend, a sign that her personal life had been turbulent in the days before her disappearance. But here's what wasn't in the car: Maura's cell phone, her debit card, her backpack. These items vanished with her into the night. The accident reconstruction told a straightforward story. Maura had been traveling east on Route 112 when she failed to navigate the sharp left curve. The Saturn struck a tree on the passenger side, spun slightly, and came to rest facing the opposite direction. The damage was moderate, certainly not catastrophic. The airbags had deployed. This wasn't a high-speed collision. This was a relatively minor accident on a road that saw its share of fender benders, especially in winter. So why didn't Maura wait for help? Why did she refuse Butch Atwood's offers of assistance? And most haunting of all, where did she go in those 9 minutes before police arrived? The New Hampshire State Police initially treated this as a standard DUI investigation. They assumed Maura had fled the scene to avoid drunk driving charges, a not uncommon scenario. They expected her to turn up within hours, either at a local hotel or back at her dorm at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. But as hours turned to days and days turned to weeks, the terrible truth became undeniable. Maura Murray hadn't simply walked away from a car accident. She had walked away from her entire life. The search began in earnest on February 11th, 2 days after the crash. New Hampshire Fish and Game deployed search and rescue teams. They brought in dogs trained to track human scent. The canines picked up Maura's scent at the crash site and followed it approximately 100 feet east along Route 112 before the trail went completely cold, right in the middle of the road. It was as if she had simply evaporated. Some theorized she'd gotten into another vehicle. But whose? Butch Atwood had been the last person to see her, and he'd gone directly home. Faith Westman had been watching from her window. No other vehicles were reported on that isolated stretch of road during those critical 9 minutes. Route 112 wasn't a busy highway. On a Monday night in February, traffic was sparse to non-existent. The wilderness surrounding the crash site offered another, darker explanation. The White Mountains of New Hampshire are beautiful but merciless. In February, temperatures regularly dropped below zero. The forests were dense, disorienting, and unforgiving. If Maura had wandered into those woods, whether by choice or in a state of confusion from the accident, she could have succumbed to hypothermia within hours. Her body could be anywhere within those 60 square miles of forest, buried under years of fallen leaves, snow, and silence. But there were problems with the wilderness theory, too. The search dogs should have picked up her scent if she'd entered the woods. The initial searches were conducted when the trail was still fresh, and Maura was an experienced athlete, a track star at UMass. Would she really have made the fatal mistake of wandering into the wilderness unprepared? As news of her disappearance spread, the media descended on Haverhill. Maura's father, Fred Murray, became a fixture in the search efforts, distributing flyers, conducting his own investigations, and refusing to let his daughter's case fade into obscurity. The family appeared on national television. The case was featured on The Disappeared, and eventually became the subject of a popular podcast that introduced Maura's story to a new generation of amateur sleuths. What captured the public imagination wasn't just the mystery of her disappearance. It was the eerie deliberateness of her actions before the crash. This wasn't a spontaneous decision. Maura had planned something. But what? And why? And did those plans have anything to do with why she vanished on that lonely stretch of Route 112? The crashed Saturn sat as silent testimony to a journey interrupted. The deployed airbags, the packed belongings, the wine, the directions to Burlington. Each item was a clue, but clues to what? A planned escape? A weekend getaway gone horribly wrong? Or something darker? A young woman running from something we still don't understand? 20 years have passed since that February night. The weathered barn that gave the curve its name has long since collapsed. The exact tree Maura struck has been marked by countless true crime enthusiasts making pilgrimages to the site. But the answer to the most basic question remains maddeningly out of reach. What happened to Maura Murray? To understand why Maura Murray disappeared, we need to rewind the clock 72 hours before that crash. Because what investigators discovered about the days leading up to February 9th painted a picture of a young woman whose seemingly perfect life was quietly falling apart at the seams. February 5th, 2004. Thursday night. University of Massachusetts Amherst. Maura Murray was working her campus security job at the front desk of a dormitory, a routine shift she'd worked dozens of times before. Around 1 a.m., a supervisor found her completely catatonic, staring into space, unresponsive to questions. When she finally came back to awareness, Maura was sobbing uncontrollably but couldn't, or wouldn't, explain what had upset her. The supervisor was so concerned she drove Maura back to her own dorm room. What triggered this breakdown? Maura never told anyone. Not her supervisor. Not her friends. Not her family. But something had shattered her composure so completely that a normally composed, high-achieving nursing student had essentially shut down. Was a phone call? An email? A sudden realization? We may never know. But this mysterious episode would later be seen as the first crack in the facade. The next day, Friday, February 6th, Maura attended her classes as if nothing had happened. Nursing classes. Labs. She went through the motions of normalcy. But those who knew her best would later say she seemed distant, distracted, Her mind was somewhere else. That evening, she drove to an off-campus party with friends. She drank. She laughed. She seemed to be coping. But at some point during the night, Maura borrowed her father's brand-new Toyota Corolla, a car he'd lent her because her own Saturn had been giving her problems. What happened next would add another layer of mystery to an already complicated timeline. Around 3:30 a.m. on Saturday morning, Maura crashed her father's car into a guardrail. Campus police arrived to find the vehicle damaged but drivable, and Maura visibly intoxicated. This wasn't just a fender bender. This was her second car accident in 48 hours, and this one came with potential legal consequences. The police report noted possible DUI charges pending. Her father's brand-new car was wrecked. The life she'd been carefully constructing was beginning to crumble. Fred Murray drove up from Connecticut that same Saturday to deal with the accident. Father and daughter spent the day together. They went car shopping, looking at replacement vehicles. They talked. Fred would later say Maura seemed upset about the accident, but otherwise normal. They looked at the damaged Saturn, the same car that would be found abandoned 3 days later on Route 112. Fred had it towed to a shop, but the mechanic told them it was still drivable despite some front-end damage. The car wasn't totaled. It just needed some work. But here's what Fred didn't know during that Saturday visit. Maura had already begun planning something. She just wasn't telling him what. Sunday, February 8th, the day before she vanished. Maura was back at UMass, and this is when her actions became methodical, purposeful, and deeply strange. She went online and researched directions. Not just any directions, multiple routes to different locations in New Hampshire and Vermont. Burlington, Vermont. Stowe, Vermont. The White Mountains of New Hampshire. She printed out MapQuest directions. She searched for information about condominium rentals in the area. She looked up hiking trails. Was she planning a vacation, a escape, or something more permanent? That same Sunday, Maura went shopping. She visited an ATM and withdrew $280, nearly all the money in her account. Then she stopped at a liquor store and purchased about $40 worth of alcohol. Vodka, boxed wine, Kahlua, Bailey's. This wasn't a bottle for a quiet night in the dorm. This was enough alcohol for an extended stay somewhere. Or perhaps, as some have darkly speculated, enough to help someone disappear permanently. She also stopped at a campus store and bought some basic provisions. Nothing elaborate, just enough for a few days away. Every action was deliberate, every purchase calculated. Maura Murray was preparing for a journey. That evening, she packed her belongings. She took textbooks. Why would someone planning to harm themselves pack school books? She took her favorite stuffed animal. She packed clothes. She gathered toiletries. Her room was left unusually tidy. She boxed up some personal items and stacked them neatly. Some of her friends would later describe it as almost ritualistic, the way someone might organize their space before a long absence. Then came the emails. Around 7 p.m. on Sunday night, Maura sent messages to her professors and her work supervisor with the same basic explanation. There had been a death in the family, and she needed to take a week off. She'd be gone for several days, dealing with the funeral and family matters. She provided no details, no name of the deceased, no location of services, just a blanket notification that she would be absent. The problem? There was no death in the family, no funeral, no emergency. It was a complete fabrication. Why would Maura create this elaborate lie? Was she buying herself time before anyone noticed she was gone? Was she planning to disappear for a week and needed a cover story? Or was the death in the family metaphorical? Was some part of her own life dying? And this was her way of mourning it? Her boyfriend Billy Roche was stationed at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, completing Army officer training. He and Maura had been in a long-distance relationship, fraught with tension. There had been accusations of infidelity on both sides. Emotional phone calls. The stress of separation. Billy would later tell investigators that Maura had seemed increasingly depressed in the weeks before her disappearance. She'd hinted at feeling overwhelmed, trapped, unsure about their future together. On that Sunday night, Maura and Billy spoke on the phone. The conversation was tense. She mentioned she wanted to get away for a few days, to clear her head. Billy encouraged her to take some time, thinking she meant a day trip or a visit to family. He had no idea she was about to vanish into the New Hampshire wilderness. Monday, February 9th, the day everything changed. Maura's actions that morning were swift and purposeful. She attended one class, her last documented appearance on campus. Then she loaded her Saturn with everything she'd packed the night before. The alcohol, the clothes, the textbooks, the stuffed animal. Approximately $4,000 in cash she'd withdrawn over previous weeks. Money that has never been found. She locked her dorm room. She got in the Saturn, still damaged from her accident, but functional enough for a road trip. And at approximately 2:30 p.m., Maura Murray left the UMass campus, heading north on Route 91 toward New Hampshire. Security cameras captured her car leaving campus. She stopped at an ATM in Amherst at 3:15 p.m., attempting to withdraw money, but finding her account empty. She'd already taken out everything the day before. Where was she going? The MapQuest directions in her car suggested Burlington, Vermont. But Route 112 in Haverhill was significantly east of that route. Had she changed her plans? Gotten lost? Or was there another destination entirely? One she'd never written down because she wanted to leave no trail? Cell phone records show Maura's phone was active as she drove north. She checked her voicemail multiple times. She made several calls that went unanswered. Her last cell phone activity pinged off a tower in Haverhill, New Hampshire at approximately 4:37 p.m., 3 hours before the crash. Then nothing. The phone either died or was turned off. That final ping would become one of the most analyzed pieces of evidence in the entire case. What was Maura doing during those 3 hours between her last phone activity and the 7:27 p.m. crash? Haverhill to the crash site on Route 112 wasn't a 3-hour drive. Was she meeting someone? Stopping somewhere? Or simply driving aimlessly through the White Mountains, wrestling with whatever demons had driven her to fabricate a family emergency and flee her life? The Saturn had been seen by witnesses earlier that evening, driving erratically on Route 112. One witness reported the car weaving slightly, though not dramatically. Another mentioned the vehicle seemed to be traveling slowly, as if the driver was unfamiliar with the area or looking for something. Or someone. By 7 p.m., Maura was approaching the weathered barn curve. The sun had set. The temperature was dropping. The roads were icy. And whatever destination she'd been seeking, whether a condominium rental, a hiking trail, or simply an escape from the pressures crushing her, was about to become irrelevant. Because in approximately 27 minutes, Maura Murray would crash her Saturn into a snowbank, refuse help from a concerned bus driver, and vanish into the New Hampshire night, leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs that led nowhere and questions that have haunted investigators for 2 decades. Her life in the 72 hours before the crash was a study in contradiction. A woman making plans for the future while simultaneously preparing to disappear. A daughter telling no one where she was going while carefully packing for an extended trip. A student fabricating a family death while withdrawing all her money and buying enough alcohol for a week-long binge, or worse. Was Maura running away? Running toward something? Or running out of options entirely? The chaos of those final days suggests a young woman in crisis, making decisions that didn't fully make sense even to her. And somewhere on that lonely stretch of Route 112, those decisions would lead her to a moment of reckoning we're still trying to understand. 9 minutes. That's all it took for Maura Murray to become a ghost story. But to understand how someone vanishes so completely, we need to examine those 9 minutes with the precision of a stopwatch and the scrutiny of a detective who knows that every second contains a clue. 7:27 p.m. Faith Westman hears a loud thump from outside her home on Route 112. She looks out her kitchen window and sees the Saturn, its nose buried in a snowbank, hazard lights blinking like a distress signal. Steam or smoke rises from the hood, later determined to be radiator fluid vaporizing in the cold air. Faith watches for a moment. She sees a figure moving near the car. The interior light is on. Someone is definitely there. But Faith doesn't go outside. Years later, she'd struggle to articulate exactly why, but something about the scene made her uneasy. Maybe it was the isolation of the location. Maybe it was a woman's intuition. Maybe it was simply the cold. Instead, she picks up the phone and calls 911. The call is logged at 7:27 p.m. She reports the accident. The dispatcher tells her police are on the way. 7:30 p.m. Faith is still watching from her window. That's when Butch Atwood's school bus rumbles into view, returning from his evening route. Butch later described what he saw. A young woman standing outside the Saturn, appearing shaken but mobile. She wasn't injured, at least not visibly. No blood. No limping. She was wearing a dark coat, too light for the weather, and seemed anxious as he approached. Butch pulled his bus to a stop and opened the door. "You okay? Need me to call someone?" The woman, later confirmed through photographs to almost certainly be Maura, was polite but firm. No, she didn't need help. She'd already called AAA. She was fine. Everything was under control. But everything wasn't under control. Butch could see that. The car was clearly damaged. The woman was underdressed for temperatures hovering around 0 degrees. And there was something about her demeanor, a nervousness that went beyond normal post-accident jitters. When Butch offered to let her come back to his house to warm up and make calls, she declined. When he suggested she at least sit in his warm bus while waiting, she declined again. "Are you sure you don't want me to call the police?" Butch asked. The question seemed to agitate her. She insisted again that she was fine, that AAA was coming, that she didn't need police involvement. Butch got the distinct impression she wanted him to leave. So he did what any reasonable person would do. He drove the 100 yards to his house and immediately called 911. The time was 7:43 p.m. 7:46 p.m. Sergeant Cecil Smith arrives at the scene. His patrol car's dashcam captures the crash site and start detail. The Saturn sits empty, driver's door now closed and locked. No Maura, no AAA truck, no other vehicles, just an abandoned car and the sound of wind through bare trees. Somewhere between 7:43 p.m., when Butch made his call, and 7:46 p.m., when police arrived, Maura Murray ceased to exist in any verifiable way. 3 minutes. Possibly less if you account for Butch's drive time and the moments it took him to get inside and dial. The window of disappearance was terrifyingly small. Sergeant Smith walked the immediate area, calling out, shining his flashlight into the darkness. He checked the car. Locked. He pressed his hand against the hood. Cold. The engine had been off for at least several minutes, possibly longer. He examined the damage. Moderate front-end collision, deployed airbags, but nothing catastrophic. This was a survivable accident. A walkaway accident. But where had she walked to? Smith radioed for backup and began a more thorough search of the area. He checked the woods immediately adjacent to the crash site. Nothing. He walked both directions along Route 112, looking for any sign of the driver. The snow on the shoulder was undisturbed beyond the immediate crash zone. If Maura had walked along the road, she'd left no obvious tracks. By 8 p.m., additional officers had arrived. They began a systematic search of the area, focusing on the woods and nearby structures. There were a few houses scattered along the stretch of Route 112, but most were seasonal vacation homes, empty and locked up for the winter. The Atwood House, the Westman House, a handful of others. Officers knocked on doors, checked out buildings, peered into windows of vacant properties. Nothing. The search dogs arrived around 10 p.m. These were experienced search and rescue animals, trained to track human scent even in challenging conditions. The handler gave them Maura's scent from items in the car, a piece of clothing, a personal belonging. The dogs immediately picked up the trail at the driver's side door. They followed it east along Route 112 for approximately 100 feet. Then the dogs stopped, right in the middle of the road. They circled, sniffed, tried to pick up the scent again. Nothing. The trail simply ended. It was as if Maura had walked 100 feet down the center of the road and then been lifted into the air. The most logical explanation? She'd gotten into a vehicle. Someone had picked her up during those critical minutes between Butch's departure and the police arrival. But who? And why hasn't that person ever come forward? Let's examine the possibilities. Route 112 on a Monday night in February was not a busy road. We know Butch Atwood passed the scene. We know Faith Westman was watching from her window. We know police arrived within minutes. For someone to have picked up Maura, they would have had to arrive during an incredibly narrow window, probably no more than 5 minutes. Some have speculated about a tandem driver, someone following Maura who was part of a planned rendezvous. This would explain why she refused help from Butch. She was waiting for someone specific. But if that's true, who was it? Investigators have never identified any such person. Maura's phone records don't show calls to anyone in the Haverhill area. Her emails contain no mention of meeting anyone. Others have suggested a chance encounter, a random driver who happened upon the accident scene and offered help. Maybe Maura, desperate to avoid a DUI charge, accepted a ride from a stranger. It's a theory that would explain the lack of premeditation but raises horrifying questions. In true crime, we know that accepting rides from strangers in isolated locations can end in tragedy. Could Maura have climbed into a vehicle with someone who meant her harm? But there's another possibility that investigators have never been able to fully dismiss. Maura didn't get into a vehicle. She ran into the woods. The search dog's losing her scent in the middle of the road has always been peculiar. Some K9 experts have suggested that if Maura walked on the plowed road surface for a distance, her scent might not transfer as strongly, especially if vehicles passed over the same area shortly after. It's possible she walked further than 100 feet before entering the woods, and the dogs simply lost the trail due to contamination from traffic. The forest surrounding Route 112 is dense and disorienting even in daylight. At night, in freezing temperatures, it would be a death trap for someone unprepared. But why would Maura run into the woods? The most common theory: she was avoiding the police because of potential DUI charges. She'd already had one alcohol-related accident 2 days earlier. Another one could mean the end of her nursing career before it even started. If Maura was intoxicated or even just worried about appearing intoxicated, she might have made the fatal decision to hide in the woods until police left. She could have planned to circle back to the car later, or walk to a nearby house once the coast was clear. But if she underestimated the cold, got disoriented, or succumbed to hypothermia, her body could be anywhere in those vast stretches of forest. Extensive searches were conducted in the days and weeks following the disappearance. Helicopters equipped with infrared cameras flew grid patterns over the area. Ground crews with cadaver dogs combed the woods. Volunteers formed human chains and walked through sections of forest, looking for any sign, a piece of clothing, a footprint, anything. They found nothing. The New Hampshire cold is merciless. Hypothermia can set in within 30 minutes of exposure at those temperatures, especially for someone not properly dressed. Maura was wearing a coat, but witnesses said it was too light for the conditions. If she wandered into the woods and became disoriented, she could have died within hours. Her body, covered by snow and then spring vegetation, might remain hidden indefinitely. The White Mountains have swallowed many hikers over the years, people with proper gear and preparation. An unprepared young woman fleeing an accident scene would have almost no chance of survival. But the wilderness theory has problems. The immediate area around the crash site was searched intensively. If Maura had collapsed from hypothermia within a reasonable distance of the road, she likely would have been found. The searches began while the trail was still fresh, before significant snow had fallen to obscure evidence. And yet nothing was ever discovered. There's also the matter of the items missing from the car. Maura's cell phone, her backpack, some personal belongings. If she ran into the woods in a panic, would she have grabbed these items? Or are they evidence that she got into a vehicle, planning to return for a car later? Faith Westman has been asked countless times about those critical minutes. Did she see any other vehicles? Did she look away from the window at any point? Her answers have remained consistent. She saw the accident. She saw the figure near the car. She called 911, and then she continued watching periodically until police arrived. She didn't see any other vehicles stop. But did she watch continuously? Or were there gaps in her observation? Human memory is fallible, especially when we're not aware we're witnessing something significant. Butch Atwood, the bus driver, became a focus of intense scrutiny. He was one of the last people to see Maura, and his house was close to the crash site. Could he have returned to the scene after calling 911? Could he have offered Maura a ride and something gone wrong? Investigators looked hard at Butch, but he had an alibi. His wife was home when he returned from his bus route, and neighbors confirmed his timeline. Butch died in 2009, taking whatever additional details he might have remembered to his grave. The physical evidence at the scene told a frustratingly incomplete story. The Saturn's black box data showed the car had been traveling approximately 35 miles per hour at the time of impact, not fast enough to cause serious injury. The deployed airbags had worked as designed. There was no blood in the vehicle, no signs of a struggle. Everything suggested a minor accident that should have resulted in an insurance claim and a tow truck, not a vanishing act. Inside the car, investigators found the wine, some opened, some not. They found Maura's AAA card, even though she'd told Butch she called AAA. Phone records later showed she hadn't. They found the printed directions to Burlington. They found her nursing textbooks. And they found a crumpled note from her boyfriend, printed from an email, with words that still haunt those who've read the case files, emotional phrases about their struggling relationship, about not knowing if they could make it work. Was Maura running away from her relationship? From her academic pressure? From legal troubles? From all of it? The car held fragments of answers, but no complete picture. As the 9-minute window closed and hours turned to days without any sign of Maura Murray, investigators faced a terrible reality. They had a witness who'd spoken to her, a relatively precise timeline, a contained geographic area, and absolutely no idea what had happened to her. She'd vanished as completely as if she'd never existed, and the woods surrounding Route 112 kept their secrets, if they held any at all. In the 2 decades since Maura Murray disappeared, her case has become something more than an unsolved mystery. It's become an obsession. An entire ecosystem of amateur investigators, podcast hosts, Reddit detectives, and armchair sleuths have dissected every detail, pursued every lead, and constructed elaborate theories about what happened on Route 112. Some of these theories are grounded in evidence. Others border on conspiracy. But all of them share a common thread: the desperate need to find answers where none seem to exist. The official investigation began with standard missing persons protocols. Police interviewed everyone who'd seen Maura in the days before her disappearance. Her friends at UMass described her as stressed but functional, a high achiever dealing with normal college pressures. Her family insisted she wasn't suicidal, wasn't the type to simply vanish without a trace. Her boyfriend Billy maintained they'd been working through their problems and had plans for the future. But as investigators dug deeper, a more complicated picture emerged. Maura had been struggling academically. Her grades had slipped during the fall semester. She'd had an incident at work where she'd been caught using a stolen credit card number to order food, a bizarre lapse in judgment for someone who'd never been in legal trouble before. The charges were eventually dropped, but it suggested someone making increasingly poor decisions. There was also the matter of the 2 car accidents in 3 days. The first one, the crash of her father's Toyota, came after a night of drinking. The second one, on Route 112, occurred under circumstances that investigators found suspicious. The damage pattern, the location, the fact that Maura vanished immediately afterward, it all suggested she might have been impaired again. Toxicology reports were impossible without a body, but the circumstantial evidence pointed toward someone potentially running from DUI consequences. This became Theory 1. Maura fled into the woods to avoid police, succumbed to hypothermia, and her body remains hidden in the vast White Mountain wilderness. It's the theory that law enforcement has generally favored. It's straightforward. It requires no unknown actors. It explains why no trace of her was ever found. The forest is simply too vast, and a body buried under years of leaves and snow could remain concealed indefinitely. Multiple searches have been conducted over the years, each employing more sophisticated technology than the last. Ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, helicopter surveys. Private investigators hired by the Murray family have explored sections of woods far from the original crash site, operating on theories that Maura might have wandered for miles before collapsing. They've found nothing. Not a scrap of clothing. Not a bone. Not a single physical trace. But the lack of evidence hasn't deterred believers in the wilderness theory. They point to other missing persons cases in the White Mountains, where bodies weren't discovered for years, sometimes decades. The terrain is unforgiving. The vegetation is dense. And if Maura veered off any established trail, she could have ended up in a ravine, under a fallen tree, anywhere that wouldn't be visible from the air or accessible to search parties. Theory 2 emerged from the witness statements and the timeline. Maura accepted a ride from someone and met with foul play. This theory has spawned countless sub-theories about who that someone might have been. A local resident? A passing motorist? Someone who knew Maura and had arranged to meet her? One suspect who garnered significant attention was a local man who lived in the area and had a history of violence against women. He was questioned multiple times by police, but never charged. He's since died, and without evidence directly linking him to Maura's disappearance, his involvement remains pure speculation. But for many online investigators, he represents the most likely suspect if foul play was involved. Then there's the tandem driver theory, the idea that someone was following Maura or had arranged to meet her near the crash site. This would explain her refusal of help from Butch Atwood. She was waiting for someone specific. Phone records have been analyzed exhaustively, looking for calls to unknown numbers that might represent a mysterious accomplice. Nothing definitive has emerged, but believers in this theory point to the fact that some of Maura's phone records from the days before her disappearance are incomplete or were never fully released to the public. Theory 3 ventures into darker psychological territory. Maura intended to disappear and succeeded. This theory posits that the crash wasn't accidental at all, but part of an elaborately staged vanishing act. The evidence, the methodical packing, the fabricated family emergency, the cash withdrawals, the research into remote locations, everything suggests premeditation. But if Maura intended to start a new life, she would have needed help. Somewhere to stay, a new identity, resources beyond a few $1,000s she'd withdrawn. Despite extensive investigation, no evidence has emerged of Maura accessing bank accounts, using credit cards, or appearing under a new name anywhere. The FBI has checked for matches against Jane Doe's, unidentified remains, and women using false identities. Nothing. Fred Murray, Maura's father, spent years pursuing this theory. He believed his daughter was alive somewhere, perhaps suffering from amnesia or living under an assumed identity. He distributed flyers across New Hampshire and Vermont. He hired private investigators. He appeared on television programs begging for anyone with information to come forward. His determination was both heartbreaking and admirable, a father refusing to believe his daughter was dead without definitive proof. Fred died in 2020, never learning what happened to Maura. His passing marked a tragic milestone in the case. One of the people who'd fought hardest for answers wouldn't live to see them. The internet's involvement in Maura's case has been both a blessing and a curse. Online communities have kept the case alive, generating publicity and keeping pressure on law enforcement to continue investigating. But they've also spread misinformation, harassed potential witnesses, and constructed elaborate conspiracy theories based on minimal evidence. One particularly persistent theory involves a local law enforcement officer supposedly covering up involvement in Maura's disappearance. This theory relies heavily on speculation about gaps in the official timeline and questions about how thoroughly certain leads were pursued. No credible evidence has ever supported these claims, but in the echo chamber of true crime forums, the theory has taken on a life of its own. The case has been featured on virtually every major true crime platform. Disappeared devoted an episode to Maura's story. The podcast Missing Maura Murray ran for years, conducting new interviews and exploring alternative theories. Oxygen produced a documentary series. Each new piece of media brings a fresh wave of attention, new tips, and renewed hope that someone, somewhere, knows something that could break the case open. Some tips have seemed promising. A woman who looked like Maura was reportedly seen at a grocery store in Quebec several months after the disappearance. The sighting was investigated, but the woman was never identified, and surveillance footage from the store had already been overwritten. A gas station attendant in Vermont claimed a confused young woman matching Maura's description had asked for directions shortly after February 9th. Police followed up, but couldn't confirm the sighting. Over the years, psychics have offered their visions. Maura is buried near Red House. Maura is in the Connecticut River. Maura is alive in Canada. None of these psychic leads have produced evidence, but desperate families sometimes grasp at any possibility, no matter how unlikely. The most recent development came in 2021 when investigators conducted a new search of a property near Route 112 based on radar imaging that suggested possible anomalies in the soil. Media coverage was intense. Could this finally be the break everyone had been waiting for? Excavation equipment was brought in. Cadaver dogs swept the area. And after days of searching, they found nothing related to Maura Murray. Just another dead end in a case built on dead ends. Technology has evolved dramatically since 2004. Cell phone tracking is more sophisticated. DNA analysis can work with smaller samples. Facial recognition software could theoretically identify Maura from surveillance footage anywhere in the world. But all the advanced technology in the world can't help if there's no evidence to analyze. Maura's family has had to endure not just the loss of their daughter and sister, but also the invasion of privacy that comes with a high-profile case. Every detail of Maura's life has been picked apart online. Her relationship with her boyfriend, her academic struggles, her work incident with a credit card, her drinking. Nothing has remained private. True crime enthusiasts have treated her life like a puzzle to be solved, sometimes forgetting that these were real events involving a real person who had hopes, fears, and complications like everyone else. The ethical questions surrounding internet sleuths and missing persons cases have only intensified since Maura's disappearance. When does public interest cross into harassment? When does theorizing become defamation? People who were barely connected to Maura, classmates, neighbors, anyone who spoke to police, have found themselves targeted by online investigators, convinced they're hiding something. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking. Law enforcement's position has remained relatively consistent. They believe Maura died of exposure in the wilderness near Route 112, and her body simply hasn't been found. They acknowledge other possibilities remain open, but without evidence of foul play, without witnesses placing her in a vehicle, without any indication she successfully started a new life elsewhere, the simplest explanation remains the most likely. But simplest doesn't mean satisfying. And in Maura Murray's case, nothing is satisfying. No explanation fully accounts for all the evidence. No theory explains away all the inconsistencies. Every answer generates new questions. Why did she leave school without telling anyone her real destination? Why did she research multiple locations, but apparently end up on Route 112, which wasn't on any of her printed directions? Why did she refuse help from Butch Atwood? What happened during those 9 minutes? Some cases go cold because evidence is lacking. Maura's case is different. There's almost too much evidence, and none of it points in a clear direction. It's a mosaic with missing pieces, and we can't tell if we're looking at a portrait of a young woman who tragically died in the woods, or something far more sinister. 20 years later, Route 112 looks much as it did in 2004. The weathered barn has collapsed. The trees have grown. But the spot where Maura's Saturn came to rest is marked in the memories of everyone who's followed this case. It's become a pilgrimage site for true crime enthusiasts, a place where people come to stand in the cold and try to understand how someone could vanish so completely. The case remains officially open. New Hampshire State Police maintain that any credible tips are still being investigated. But as years turn into decades, the likelihood of finding answers diminishes. Witnesses die. Memories fade. Evidence degrades. The forest keeps whatever secrets it might hold. And somewhere in the woods, in an unmarked grave, in a new life under a different name, or in a scenario no one has yet imagined, is the truth about what happened to Maura Murray on a cold February night in 2004. There are missing persons cases that fade from public consciousness within weeks. Cases where the investigation goes cold, the media moves on, and eventually even the families stop hoping for answers. Maura Murray's case is not one of them. 2 decades after she vanished on Route 112, the obsession has only intensified. The question isn't just what happened to Maura Murray anymore. It's why we can't let her go. Perhaps it's because Maura was so relatable. She wasn't a runaway teenager or someone living on society's margins. She was a nursing student at a respected university. She was an athlete. She had a family who loved her, friends who cared about her, a boyfriend waiting for her. She was, by all accounts, someone with a future. And that's what makes her disappearance so unsettling. If it could happen to Maura Murray, it could happen to anyone. Or perhaps it's the breadcrumbs. Maura left just enough clues to suggest intention without revealing her actual plan. The packed car, the withdrawn cash, the fabricated family emergency, the alcohol, the directions to multiple locations. Every piece of evidence suggests she was going somewhere, doing something, escaping something. But what? The breadcrumbs lead to the edge of the forest and then vanish into darkness. The psychological profile of Maura in those final days has been debated endlessly. Was she suicidal? The evidence is contradictory. She packed textbooks. Why would someone planning to end their life bring schoolwork? She withdrew money systematically over weeks. That suggests planning for a future, not escaping one. But she also bought enough alcohol for a serious binge, fabricated an elaborate lie to her professors, and drove alone to one of the most isolated regions of New Hampshire in the dead of winter. Some psychologists who've studied the case suggest Maura might have been in a dissociative state, not quite suicidal, but not fully rational either. She was under enormous pressure. The car accidents, the potential academic consequences, the troubled relationship, the work incident with the credit card. Any one of these might be manageable, but all of them combined could push someone toward irrational decision-making. The catatonic episode at her security job 4 days before she disappeared takes on new significance in this context. What caused that breakdown? A phone call, an email, a sudden realization that her carefully constructed life was falling apart? Maura never explained it to anyone, and that unexplained episode has become one of the most haunting details of the case. It was a warning sign that something was seriously wrong, but no one understood what they were seeing until it was too late. Fred Murray spent the last 16 years of his life searching for his daughter. He became an expert on the case, memorizing every detail, pursuing every lead, challenging every assumption made by law enforcement. He believed with absolute conviction that the initial search had been inadequate, that critical evidence had been overlooked, that his daughter could still be found if only people would look harder. His devotion was extraordinary and heartbreaking. He conducted his own searches of the wilderness, hiring guides to take him into remote areas where he thought Maura might have wandered. He investigated properties near Route 112, sometimes trespassing in his desperation to find answers. He gave countless interviews, appeared on numerous television programs, and maintained a website dedicated to finding Maura. But Fred's intensity also created friction. He clashed with law enforcement, accusing them of incompetence and cover-ups. He pursued theories that investigators felt were unsubstantiated. The relationship between the Murray family and the New Hampshire State Police became strained, complicated by mutual frustration and the terrible weight of unanswered questions. When Fred Murray died in September 2020, the true crime community mourned not just for him, but for what his death represented. The possibility that this case might never be solved, that the people who loved Maura most might die without ever knowing what happened to her. Fred was buried without the closure he'd spent nearly 2 decades seeking. Maura's siblings have continued the search. Her sister Julie has been particularly vocal, maintaining social media accounts dedicated to the case, coordinating with private investigators, and keeping public pressure on law enforcement. The family's persistence has ensured that Maura's case hasn't been forgotten, but it's also meant living in a state of permanent grief, unable to move forward because there's no definitive ending. The impact on Maura's boyfriend Billy has been profound as well. For years, some online investigators treated him as a potential suspect, dissecting his every statement, questioning his timeline, suggesting he somehow had involvement in Maura's disappearance. The scrutiny was intense and, by all evidence, unwarranted. Billy has repeatedly cooperated with investigators, maintained his account of events, and expressed his own anguish over Maura's disappearance. The case has destroyed lives in ways both obvious and subtle. The witnesses who saw Maura that night have had to relive those moments countless times. Butch Atwood, the bus driver who offered her help, was questioned repeatedly before his death, always wondering if there was something more he could have done. Faith Westman, who made that first 911 call, has been interviewed by investigators, journalists, and documentary filmmakers so many times that the memory has been replayed into exhaustion. Even the town of Haverhill has been changed by Maura's disappearance. What was once a quiet rural community became the epicenter of one of America's most discussed missing persons cases. True crime enthusiasts make pilgrimages to Route 112, standing at the crash site, walking the road, trying to understand how someone could vanish so completely. Some locals welcome the attention, hoping it might finally generate the tip that solves the case. Others resent the intrusion, tired of being defined by a tragedy that happened 20 years ago. The economics of true crime have transformed cases like Maura's into content. Podcasts monetize the mystery. YouTube channels accumulate views by presenting new theories about what happened. Books are published. Documentary series are produced. There's an entire industry built around Maura Murray's disappearance, and while it keeps the case in the public eye, it also raises uncomfortable questions about the ethics of profiting from tragedy. Does the constant coverage help? It's generated tips, some of which have led to searches and investigations. It's kept pressure on law enforcement to continue working the case. It's ensured that if someone out there knows something, they're constantly reminded that information is still wanted. But it's also spread misinformation, created false leads, and subjected innocent people to suspicion and harassment. The most frustrating aspect of Maura's case is how tantalizingly close we seem to be to understanding it while remaining absolutely in the dark. We know so much about her final days. We know what she packed, where she went, what she bought, who she talked to. We have a precise timeline of the accident and the minutes afterward. We have witness statements and physical evidence and phone records. And yet somehow, none of it adds up to an answer. It's the paradox of information in the digital age. We have more data than ever before, But data without context is just noise. And in Maura's case, we have plenty of noise, but no clear signal pointing toward what actually happened. Some investigators believe the answer is actually quite simple, that all the complicating factors and mysterious details are red herrings. Maura was a young woman dealing with stress who made the unfortunate decision to take a spontaneous road trip. She crashed her car, panicked about the legal consequences, fled into the woods, and died of exposure. The body hasn't been found because the wilderness is vast and bodies can remain concealed for decades. Everything else, the packed belongings, the withdrawn cash, the fake family emergency, was just the chaotic decision-making of someone in crisis. This explanation is rational and requires no conspiracy, no unknown actors, no elaborate schemes. It's probably what happened, but probably isn't certainty. And in the absence of certainty, the human mind fills in the gaps with speculation, theory, and doubt. Others remain convinced there's more to the story. The 9-minute window feels too convenient. The lack of any trace feels too complete. The circumstances feel too unusual. Something happened on Route 112 that we don't understand, involving factors or people we haven't identified. Until that missing piece is found, the case will remain unsolved. What makes Maura Murray's disappearance particularly haunting is that it exists at the intersection of the analog and digital ages. In 2004, we had cell phone records and security cameras, but not the saturation of surveillance that exists today. We had internet searches and email, but not the comprehensive digital footprint that would make disappearing nearly impossible now. Maura vanished at exactly the moment when technology should have made it harder to disappear completely, but hadn't yet made it impossible. If Maura had disappeared 5 years later, we might have GPS data from her phone showing her exact route. We might have traffic cameras capturing her car at key intersections. We might have social media posts revealing her state of mind. But 2004 was just before that level of digital omnipresence became standard. There are gaps in the record, gaps large enough for a person to slip through and vanish. The case has spawned numerous theories about other missing persons, cases that might be connected. Could Maura have been the victim of a serial predator operating in New Hampshire? Several women have gone missing in the region over the years, and while investigators have found no evidence linking the cases, the speculation persists. Pattern seeking is human nature, and when confronted with an unsolvable mystery, we sometimes try to connect it to other mysteries in hopes that solving one might solve them all. But most likely, Maura's disappearance is singular, not part of a pattern, not connected to other cases, just a unique combination of circumstances, decisions, and chance that resulted in a young woman vanishing on a cold February night. As the 20th anniversary of Maura's disappearance came and went in February 2024, the true crime community once again focused attention on the case. New searches were proposed. Old theories were re-examined. The cycle continues, as it has for 2 decades, as it probably will for decades to come. Because here's what we know for certain. On February 9, 2004, Maura Murray drove north from Massachusetts into New Hampshire. She crashed her car on Route 112 in Haverhill. She was seen by multiple witnesses, and then she was gone. Everything else, every theory, every explanation, every carefully constructed timeline, is speculation built on fragments of evidence that refuse to form a complete picture. Maybe someday a hiker will discover remains in the White Mountain Wilderness. Maybe a deathbed confession will reveal what happened during those 9 minutes. Maybe advancing technology will uncover evidence that was missed 20 years ago. Or maybe Maura Murray will remain forever what she's become, a ghost story, a cautionary tale, a mystery that represents everything unsettling about how quickly and completely a life can disappear. Her case reminds us that we live in a world where not everything can be explained, where not every question has an answer, where sometimes people vanish and we never learn why. It's an uncomfortable truth in an age when we expect technology and determination to eventually solve everything. The weathered barn that gave the crash site its name collapsed years ago. The exact tree Maura struck has been marked so many times by visitors that the bark is scarred with remembrance. Route 112 continues to wind through the White Mountains, carrying travelers who probably don't know that one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries unfolded along this very stretch of road. And somewhere in the data, the witness statements, the physical evidence, or the vast New Hampshire wilderness, the truth about what happened to Maura Murray waits. Whether it will ever be found is another question entirely, one that may remain unanswered for another 20 years, or perhaps forever. What do we do with unsolved mysteries like this? We tell their stories. We keep asking questions. We refuse to let the disappeared be forgotten, because Maura Murray was more than a case file or a true crime phenomenon. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a young woman with dreams and fears, and a future that was stolen away on a freezing February night. Her story doesn't have an ending yet, but it has witnesses, millions of people who've heard her name, learned her story, and wondered what happened on Route 112. As long as people keep asking those questions, as long as the case remains alive in public consciousness, there's hope that someday, somehow, the silence will break. Until then, Maura Murray remains what she's been for 20 years, a question mark on a lonely New Hampshire road, a mystery that refuses to be solved, and a reminder that sometimes the most frightening stories are the ones without endings.